Okay, this is really just a picture to capture your interest, because we're talking about today is cryptozoology, and I know that there are a bunch of you who know that word already. Do you know that word, cryptozoology? Well, it really means the science of hidden animals. It's a fancy way of saying that. And before we get started on that, I just want to show you, I've actually written 20 books. This is a cryptozoology book that I wrote about Sasquatch. In particular, it's about what to do if you actually saw something or found a footprint or heard a sound or smelled something weird, how to write that down and report it so that people would understand and believe what you said. Otherwise, they just kind of blow you off. Oh, yeah, right, whatever. And this book is about 4 years old. I brought some copies to sell if those of you would like to get that Christmas present for the person who is hard to satisfy. This is probably it. But even more so, another book I brought along with me is this is my magnum opus, the Eat a Bug Cookbook. It's been in print for about 20 years now. And this is 40 recipes for cooking with everything from little tiny termites and ants all the way up to big tarantula spiders. I know. You know, it's the fun fact is that 80% of the world's cultures actually eat bugs. And we're in that 20% that thinks it's weird. So we eat all sorts of weird stuff by other people's standards too. Okay, now, just to conclude my infomercial here, I want to say if you decide to give this book to someone for Christmas, let's say, I can almost guarantee you they're not going to go, oh no, not another bug cookbook. So it's a good, hard to please kind of book. But really what we're talking about is cryptozoology tonight. And cryptozoology, we have this gentleman to thank. That's the guy on the left, that is. That's Bernard Heuvelmans. He's a Belgian scientist. He's no longer alive. But in the 1950s, he wrote a big, thick book called On the Track of Unknown Animals. And he invented this word cryptozoology. Certainly there were people, excuse me, who were interested in the subject, but they didn't really have a name to put on it. So that's where that comes from. I learned later that this is one of his pets. He actually had his own like private zoo of monkeys and chimps and things like that. That was his interest, was keeping these, well, relatives of ours, the great apes and so on, as pets. An interesting guy. Well, Bernard Heuvelmans actually created a scheme for how to organize all the different kinds of cryptids. That's what you're looking at if you're a cryptozoologist. So I want to run through the basic types of cryptids, and then we're going to talk about sea serpents. We'll go back to the slide we saw at the very beginning of this talk and talk about some of the stuff that's right here in the Northwest, in our lakes, particularly in eastern Washington, I'm happy to report, and then in the coastal areas on the other side of the mountains. Okay, so when Heuvelmans decided to arrange all these, sort of the family tree, if you will, of cryptids, the first group, well, excuse me, first I want to just show you that not all of these things are sensationalistic. This is a newsletter for the International Society of Cryptozoology, and you can see on this one, they discovered a large gecko, a lizard. So not everything is monstrous and scary. It's more about unusual and, gee, we didn't know it even existed. That's what cryptozoologists are interested in. Okay, in his scheme of things, the first group is called Unconfirmed, and those are animals where their existence is they're said to exist, but there's no scientific proof or even close proof to establish their existence. A great example of this is the unicorn. There's a nice old drawing of what people thought unicorns looked like. There's no science at all behind the existence of a unicorn, but they're all over the place. I see them on shower curtains and baby t-shirts and you name it. It turns out that the whole myth of the unicorn was started by the Vikings. The Vikings were traveling around. They had these long horns from narwhals. Narwhals are marine animals with a single tusk. It's actually one large tooth. And they had access to those. People in Europe hadn't seen them before. So they were saying, these belong to this magical white horse, and I'll sell you one for a lot of money. They can do all this magical stuff with them. You'll stay forever young. And if you look at that horn, it looks a lot like a narwhal tusk. It's got that same curvy nature that those tusks have. No evidence for this animal. The other group, he says, is disputed. And I find this interesting because there's a lot of hearsay about some creatures, but the body of evidence isn't really supportive of it. And a great example of this would be these giant snakes. Every now and then you see pictures on the internet taken from airplanes of these creatures like this one. It must be about 50 feet or longer in length. You can imagine those are trees on the banks. They're not little mosses. There's no evidence at all that there are snakes that get any larger than, well, here's the biggest record holder right now, 28 feet. This is a snake that's at the zoo in Fort Worth, Texas. You can see that 28 feet, that's plenty of snake. More than a few people can hold on to. I'll tell you, there's actually a prize out, $50,000 prize, offered by the New York Zoological Society for any snake that someone can turn in that's over 30 feet in length. But before you all quit your day jobs to go out after that snake, I need to tell you the prize was first offered in 1910. And Teddy Roosevelt was one of the people who proposed it, probably in like one of those drinking bets, prove it, and it's still out there. Okay, here's one that's proposed. It's where evidence has been put forth, but has not yet been accepted by the scientific community. And that's an easy one, Bigfoot. There's lots of evidence out there. There are some very convincing footprints that show the flexion of the foot. They're obviously not someone cut something out of plywood and stomped around. But the scientific community is very conservative. They don't want to stick their necks out and be proven wrong, or worse yet, made fools of. So there's not a lot of buy-in for that. When I worked at the University of Washington, scientists would talk about each other and they'd say, oh, he's not highly regarded, which is a scientific way of saying he's full of it. But that's the last thing you want to do, is be denied a promotion because you started studying Bigfoot. Okay, another group, these are animals that were formerly classified as cryptids, long time ago, but in more recent times they've been proven real. And there's lots of those. There's a whole little zoo of these creatures that people didn't believe existed. The okapi is a really great example. People in the Congo of Africa would say there's a horse-like creature that lives in our forests. And they were talking about this thing. It's actually a relative of the giraffe, about the size of a horse, lives in thick forests. And it wasn't until 1880 that a British gentleman actually shot one and shipped its body back to London so scientists could study it. And now everyone was in agreement that it existed. Here's another one, the panda. We all know pandas exist, but this is a panda cub. Almost looks fake to me, looks like a cartoon. It wasn't until 1905 that people saw these things outside of China. A German missionary actually bought a panda cub like this one and then brought it back to Germany so people could see it. And now they understood the giant panda existed. 1905. I really find this group interesting. animals that people thought were extinct but may in fact exist in relic populations. So some people think the Sasquatch is actually a living fossil of a creature called Gigantopithecus. That was an 8 to 10 foot tall big ape, lived during the same time as early humans, and 10 feet tall, covered with hair. It ate bamboo. Well, scientists say it went extinct, but some people say no, it actually just crossed the land bridge into North America, and that's what we're seeing today as Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Here's another good example. This is what's called a plesiosaur. These are aquatic dinosaurs. They are believed to be extinct, but often when you see pictures of what the Loch Ness monster looks like, it looks just like a plesiosaur. I was giving this talk in OMAC at the library, and a gentleman came up to me afterwards and said, I saw a plesiosaur when I was a kid driving in a car with my dad around OMAC Lake. So who knows? He said it was bright green, and his dad said, you must be dreaming, but he definitely saw this thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about native North American ideas about plesiosaurs and things like that in just a minute. This is maybe one of my favorite slides. This is a fossil skeleton of a giant sea turtle. It's in the collection at the Yale University library, and you can see quite large. But what's really amazing to me, it's missing a foot. See, it doesn't have its hind flipper. And when they look at the fossil, they can tell that some even bigger animal bit off this foot and swallowed it. So, heavens to Betsy, who knows what was in those oceans way back when? You've probably read about a creature called Megalodon. It was a giant shark. If elephants were around when it was alive, it could have swallowed an elephant in one bite. Really enormous jaws. And more reasonable living fossils. This one is called a coelacanth. In the 1930s, this gentleman, a fish scientist in South Africa, was visiting a local market, a fish market in South Africa, and recognized this creature as something really unusual. It's actually what they call a lobe-finned fish. It's a relative of those very early creatures that first crawled out of the ocean and onto dry land. So instead of having flipper-like fins, it really has more like, almost like little stumpy feet for getting around. Now that they know these things exist, they find them often because they're down very far, about 100 feet under the ocean. I worked at a museum in Chicago that had 3 specimens all preserved in alcohol. So for one museum to have 3 of them, they're not that rare. In fact, you can actually pay good money and go on a scuba diving trip down in Indonesia to about 100 feet and swim with these coelacanths, strange looking creatures. Here's a newspaper article I saw in February. They thought that this tortoise was extinct for about 100 years. They found one last one. It was a dead specimen of a male. They'd never even seen a female. And this film crew from the Animal Planet network went to the Galapagos. They went to one of the really remote and seldom visited islands, and they discovered a whole bunch of these guys were doing just fine on that island. So even nowadays, we're finding these creatures that we didn't know existed. Just about every trip to the Amazon rainforest, they bring back new plants, new birds, new insects, all sorts of stuff, and even some large stuff like oxen-sized animals in Burma, for example. They just didn't know they were there. Here's my second favorite group, hoaxes, where people's inventing something to fool people. Keep in mind, we're primates. We like monkey business, and we're always monkeying around with facts. So if you see a jackalope head hanging on a wall in a truck stop in Montana, rest assured it doesn't exist. It's just some taxidermist was having fun and took a jackrabbit and put antelope horns on it, and there you have it. Even crazier is this postcard I have in my collection of a fur-bearing trout. It's just what every fisherman wants to catch. Doesn't exist. But some of these things are pretty convincing. This is a picture of the Loch Ness monster that was taken quite some time ago, and the gentleman who took this photograph confessed on his deathbed, one of the last things he did, that this is a fake. He took a wood carving and put it on one of those remote-controlled boats and then took a picture of it out in the water. So, darn. This is not to say that there isn't something worth investigating in Loch Ness. People have been seeing a Loch Ness creature for over 100 years. And this is actually a drawing that was done for a magazine in the 1940s, the Saturday Evening Post. But it's recounting the story of this guy up in the corner who was coming home late at night in the 1930s on his motorcycle around Loch Ness, and he had to stop and let this thing cross the road and go right back into the loch. I like this. I like that it's blowing steam because it's a warm-blooded creature, I guess. But also that it doesn't have scales, it has like fur. And that's a nice detail. When we get a little further in, you'll see how that pertains to some of the other creatures that we're seeing or being told are existing nowadays. If I were going to look for a cryptid, I definitely would go into the ocean. This is a picture from Jules Verne's book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And when Jules Verne wrote this book, it was the 1860s. The idea of going down any further than about 5 or 10 feet was science fiction. It was like, a voyage to Mars. People thought in the 1860s that if you went down below about 100 feet, there was no life in the ocean at all. It's too dark down there. Plants couldn't grow. There was no food, nothing to eat. There was the empty abyss. Well, of course, nowadays we know that there are all sorts of things living down there. Glow-in-the-dark fish and invertebrates. And more recently, in the 1960s, they discovered these undersea volcanoes that are about a mile down in the ocean that have all sorts of life growing around them that no one had seen before the 1960s. Again, we're still learning a lot. Here's something that people didn't know existed in the ocean until the 1970s. And this is a big shark called Megalodon. It lives very deep down, but it comes up apparently into shallower water, shallow being like about 100 feet at night. It's what they call a vertical migrator. It goes up and down. This thing, the way they discovered it is kind of amazing. They looked, there's a ship out off of the coast of Hawaii, a Navy ship, and it's too deep there to put down an anchor. So they wanted to stay in one place. They use a thing called a sea anchor, which is a giant piece of canvas. It's like a sail, only it's underwater. And it sort of just helps to hold the ship in one place. Well, this thing apparently came up from the deep water, got interested in the sea anchor and swallowed it and drowned. It couldn't spit it out. It choked basically. So in the morning when the captain says up anchor and they pulled up the sea anchor, this thing was attached to it. It represents an entirely new species of shark, but also a whole new genus, a whole new group of sharks no one knew was there. Now that they know what to look for, they're finding them more often. And if you're curious, you can actually see a preserved specimen on display at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. Looks pretty wild. What's really wild is this thing has a glow-in-the-dark mouth. It lives in a pitch-dark environment, but it has bacteria that glow in the dark. They're called bioluminescent bacteria. And when it opens its mouth, it's like having the porch light on our front porch. Instead of attracting moths and insects, it attracts all the creatures that are down in that darkness, and it swallows them. Wild animal. Something you'd think I had just made up. Okay, now this is an abrupt transition because we're going from a black and white picture of an unusual animal to a color picture of a scientist. But this gentleman is a friend of mine. I've known him for a long time. This is Professor Paul LeBlanc. He's now retired, but he used to teach at University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and he's an oceanographer. His real passion is studying waves. He really likes the mechanics, the physics of what makes waves work, whether they're big ones or small ones. But at some point he got interested in studying cryptozoology, and he decided to study these reports of, well, here's the paper, observations of large unidentified marine animals in British Columbia and adjacent waters. This is a publication that came out in the early 70s, so it's not a desktop published. Some stenographer had to type this whole thing in and make corrections with white out liquid paper. And I was fascinated when I read this report because he's a scientist. He's not just a guy running around with a butterfly net going, I seen him, I seen him. He's a very capable scientist and a good writer. He actually went on and wrote a book called Discovering Cadborosaurus, that creature I was showing you of a painting of in the very beginning of this talk. So if you're looking for a good late night read, I'm sure you can get this through interlibrary loan and read it yourself. But going back to this original report, here's the abstract. That's kind of like the summary of what's in this big report. He says this report presents the results of a survey beginning at the end of 1969 on, I love the little quotes there, sea monsters. But what I really like is the second sentence, the fundamental question of existence remains unresolved. So he's saying, I'm not saying whether they exist or not, I'm just saying this is what people say they saw. He took 57 of these reports and he kind of combined them and looked for similarities and found that there were 3 different kinds of creatures that cryptids, that people were reporting with regularity. So here's what those 3 types were. Type 1, see, he's a scientist, he's not making up names for them. Type 1 has very large eyes, a horse-shaped head, a long neck, a body showing 3 humps, covered with short fur, kind of like that Loch Ness drawing from the 1940s, and fast swimmers. And he asked people to submit sketches of what they saw. Here's a sketch of this kind of creature. This was drawn by a commercial fisherman in the Strait of Georgia, just off of Vancouver Island. And you can see it has a red eye. It has small ears, a 10-foot tall neck, and covered with a light brown hair. It says much like coconut fiber. So this guy is a commercial fisherman. He said in his report, I've seen really big seals, even elephant seals, which are enormous. And this was not one of those. This thing popped its head up, watched him and his fishing partner for a while. They all stared in disbelief, and then it ducked back under the water and they never saw it again. Type 2, they say, is similar to type 1, has smaller eyes, a long floppy mane, and short giraffe-like horns. Here's what a drawing of this one looks like. This is one that was seen by a couple On January 1st. I love that date. So were they hung over from New Year's? We don't know. But they were in Yachats, Oregon. So just off the Oregon coast, staring out. It was like they're what they do on New Year's Day, go for a walk. They were looking from a high altitude at the water, and they saw this thing swimming towards shore. So they actually got in their car and followed it as it swam along for a couple of miles until it finally got out of sight. They couldn't follow it anymore. Kind of amazing. You can see it has that long mane. Some people say it looks like seaweed, and two little giraffe-like horns. The third type is different than the other two, but probably more in keeping with what people say are sea serpents. It's serpentine in form. In other words, its body is long and snake-like. And instead of flapping its flippers, it swims with loops of its body, like a snake would. It has one jagged fin along its back, and its head is sheep-like. Interesting detail. Now, sea serpents, there's a long history of people seeing these things. Here's the drawing of the type that Mrs. McLean, another Canadian, saw, but doesn't really show us much other than that long fin. Here's a nice drawing from the mid-1800s. This ship is called the Daedalus. It's a British ship, and the entire crew of this ship and the captain saw this thing that they described looking like a giant eel or giant snake. And you know, for a British sea captain to stick his neck out and say he saw something that unusual, these guys are very circumspect. They don't like making up stories and being known as hysterics. So there's some validity in having the journal of a sea captain saying they saw this thing. Here's what I think is really curious. This fish is called an oarfish, and it looks a lot like that description. It has that long fin along the length of its back. It has a head that's kind of sheep-like. It even has a little rooster comb. The other thing that's interesting is these fish, while they're quite large, this one I think was captured off the coast of Mexico, they don't swim in this direction. They actually swim upright, straight up and down, and kind of get carried by currents. So if you saw a head like this sticking out of the water, you would definitely think you'd seen a monster of some sort. The thing that makes it really curious, though, is these creatures don't get up this far north. They probably go as far as the beaches of Southern California, but they don't like cold water. So whether anyone's seeing them up here, as some people have reported, seems unlikely. But there's lots that's going on that we don't really know yet. So I'm holding out for the day when they actually capture one of these, a live one, off the coast of Vancouver Island. This is one of my prized possessions. This is a Canadian 39-cent stamp of a lake monster, or if you want to be more elegant about it, an aquatic cryptid called Ogopogo. Have any of you heard of Ogopogo? I think Ogopogo is almost as famous as Bigfoot. Now, Ogopogo is said to live in Okanagan Lake, just across the border in Canada, so maybe 3 hours drive from here, 3 or 4 hours. And it's a very large and unusually deep lake, and there have been lots of sightings of Ogopogo. I do want to point out, though, that this person who drew this stamp took characteristics from lots of different aquatic cryptids, including the giraffe horns and red eyes, and just kind of added it all together to be fanciful. But people have been seeing this creature. As I mentioned earlier, there were 3 sightings last year. People actually took videotapes. This year, last March, there was 1 sighting. I was actually trying to get up there this summer, but there was a series of forest fires that made it difficult to drive up from the area like Tonasket across the border and go up. So I didn't make it. But I had to satisfy myself, like so many other people, by going online and looking at pictures. You know, a lot of these pictures are kind of fuzzy. It's sort of like, are these creatures fuzzy or are the pictures fuzzy? We don't know. But here's one picture. Looks like a head of something. Here's another picture. This thing actually, according to the reports, was moving. So it's not just a log or a pile of rocks. It's hard to tell which end is which, but fascinating. And probably the best picture I saw of Ogopogo when I went online was this one, until I learned that it's actually a statue that people put into the water so that scuba divers could have something to send home to amaze their friends. Darn. The gentleman I was telling you about in Omak, who told me about seeing the plesiosaur, told me that among Native Americans there's a belief that a lot of our lakes are interconnected underground by aquifers. And that's where we get our water for wells, for example. And a lot of the lakes in the Columbia Plateau, that's what this map is showing, a lot of those lakes have stories, legends, or what you want to call them, about lake creatures. According to Native American belief, because these are connected by aquifers, and I have to tell you, the colors on this map are really just showing the different kinds of rock that's down there. It's not anything dramatic. But allegedly, one creature could swim from one lake to another lake through these connecting tunnels and things. That's what people say about the Loch Ness monster, that may actually be able to go out to the ocean. So if you can connect from one lake to another, you probably could also connect and go right into the Columbia River. This is an article I just got a little clipping from about colossal Claude, who was a sea creature that was seen at the mouth of the Columbia at Astoria, Oregon, by a whole crew of a lightship. Now these lightships were like floating lighthouses, so that ships knew where to come into the Columbia. And actually, when these guys saw this thing, they actually asked the captain, can we lower a boat and go after it? And the captain said, no way, it's going to be too dangerous, so stick around. So from time to time, people still have these sightings of this creature, colossal Claude, right there at the mouth of the Columbia. Okay, what I'd like to end this part of my program with is a quote from John Steinbeck. People say John Steinbeck is among America's greatest authors. He wrote a lot of works of fiction, like Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath. But he also wrote some narratives. I just finished reading Travels with Charlie, about traveling around the United States with his poodle Charlie. And more to the point, he wrote a book about the log from the Sea of Cortez, where he was traveling with a marine biologist in the Sea of Cortez off the coast of Mexico. And he says in this thing, I love this quote, when sometimes a true sea serpent, complete and undecayed, is found or caught, a shout of triumph will go through the world. There, you see, men will say, I knew they were there all the time. I just had a feeling they were there. And he concludes, men really need sea monsters in their personal oceans. Now he's saying men here. I don't think he means mansplaining. I think he just means people. He goes on to say, an ocean without its unnamed monsters would be like a completely dreamless sleep. I totally agree with this. In the dedication to my Sasquatch book, I talk about the fact that we need Sasquatch more than Sasquatch needs us. That there's a yearning we have for mystery, even though we live in this age where you can pretty much find the answer to anything with your smartphone. It's not the answers to everything. And we like the idea that there are unknown things out there. things that are fantastical, and that maybe the next generation will be among the people who actually solve that mystery and resolve this. So young people in the audience, it's up to you. I'm putting my money on you guys to resolve the mystery of Cadborosaurus and Sasquatch and all these other cryptids. Okay, last picture is a cartoon someone sent me recently. He's going, look, look, to the right of Cadborosaurus. It's a coho salmon. I like it. And you know, the way things are going, the way we're managing our fisheries, the way that salmon are in trouble nowadays, who knows, 100 years from now, people will be talking about stuffed salmon hanging on the wall, just like we're talking about jackalopes or fur-bearing trout. So we have to do our part to protect the world's creatures. In some ways, in places like the Amazon, we're losing a lot of wildlife before we've even studied it. So conservation is an important message in all of this. We don't want to be out there getting the last of any of these creatures. All right, let me end by going back to the picture in the front. It's such a great painting. Has all those characteristics in a very believable form. And you know, I was talking earlier, I actually saw a fin of something, who knows what, a long time ago when I was out right on the Strait of Juan de Fuca, right across from Victoria, where this thing is seen a lot. And I saw this giant fin that was kind of the color of the underbelly that this painter has given this Cadborosaurus creature. So who knows? I might be one of those I seen them people. All right, well, that's my part of the program. I wonder if any of you, let's turn the lights back on, and I wonder if any of you have things you'd like to add or questions you'd like to ask that I can give you an answer or make up something. All right, let me just creep up here. Anybody? Well, good. I guess I said it all. I do have books for sale. They're $15. And thank you all for coming in tonight. This is a great way to end my week's worth of programs.
Thank you.